just to begin with, in this video, I'm going to be talking about a concept that is mentioned in a lot of religious eschatology, both in the context of the Quran and Islamic law, and in the Bible and Christian law. Of course, as a believer, as a Muslim myself, I think that only God truly knows the reality of this concept. But what I am going to talk about is a probabilistic interpretation, one that may possibly be correct but also may possibly be wrong. So keep that in mind. But what I'm going to be talking about is the idea of Gog and Magog, or Ya'juj and Ma'juj, and the historical parallels that this concept or this group of historical peoples has to the nomadic steppe anti-civilization. So Gog and Magog, or Ya'juj and Ma'juj, are essentially these historical peoples who, in eschatological understandings, in certain religious law, they are trapped behind this kind of barrier, and they will come at the end of times and they will conquer most of the known world. But there's an interesting historical parallel to be noted here. You see, as a historical peoples, these two groups are a vicious, warlike, conquering peoples, and wherever they go, they cause chaos and wreak havoc, and they kill the subjugated peoples, and they torture them, and they oppress them, and they treat them in a very vicious manner. And this has an interesting parallel to the nomadic steppe anti-civilization, quote unquote. The nomads of the Eurasian steppe have organized themselves every few hundred or so years, and they've conquered the neighboring civilizations surrounding them. And this has led to the loss of countless life and the destruction of countless civilizations and bastion of civilizations, and has led to the downfall of different empires as well. Of course, the most notable of these is the Mongol invasions, which destroyed obviously the Chinese empire of the time, and they conquered the whole of China. They conquered half the Muslim world, and they destroyed countless Muslim cities, including Baghdad, which was the kind of cosmopolitan center of the world at the time. And they conquered a lot of Eastern Europe, they conquered Russia, and they were at the doorsteps of Europe for a very long time. All that is to say is that, of course, these nomadic steppe peoples have conquered a lot of the world, a lot of the known world at the time, so to speak, where they've organized themselves every few hundred or so years, and they've led these conquests, which were very vicious, warlike, and where they killed many of their conquered peoples in a very barbaric manner. This strikes a interesting historic parallel to the Ya'juj and Ma'juj, or the Gog and Magog, described in biblical and Quranic accounts. This warlike, vicious, brutal peoples who oppress the subjugated peoples they conquer. And hence, it leads me to believe that, this kind of historical Ya'juj or Ma'juj are essentially a kind of civilizational descendant, or a kind of civilizational, how do I say this, like forebearer perhaps, of the nomadic steppe sort of anti-civilization. Essentially, Ya'juj and Ma'juj were one of the many groups who were part of the nomadic steppe anti-civilization, who conquered the various civilizations around them and who oppressed many of their subjugated peoples. And this makes sense in a historical basis. Of course, in modern times, the nomadic steppe anti-civilization can't organize itself because of the sheer difference in, modern technology and mere manpower. Hence, even though, on a individual physical level, they are much superior to the average person in the world, if they were to organize themselves, they would still be obliterated by modern weaponry. However, if, let's say, there was to come a time when, let's say, a nuclear Armageddon happens and civilization collapses and most of the known world, falls into decadence and weakness, conceivably in the future, then a new version, a new organization of the nomadic steppe anti-civilization can again organize itself, and because the rest of the world would be reduced to pre-modern technology, they would be able to conquer the civilization surrounding them again. And hence, it's interesting then to read the idea of Ya'juj and Ma'juj as a possible parallel to the historical anti-civilization of the nomadic steppe, essentially. And the reason why I suggest this interpretation is that because when it comes to certain eschatology or certain law within religious sort of myths and religious stories, a lot of them bear similarities to real peoples and real historical civilizations. For example, when the Quran talks about the Romans, in a modern context, we understand it typically to refer to their civilizational inheritors, the modern West, and of course, for example, that kind of civilizational legacy continues, and those civilizational patterns play out over time. And so, Ya'juj and Ma'juj could be a kind of historical, kind of like parallel, really, to the historical reality of the nomadic steppe anti civilization. And what could play out in the future, perhaps, is if civilization were to collapse back to a pre modern level, the nomadic steppe anti civilization could once again reorganize itself and conquer most of the world once again.